The moment I opened my grandmother's old wooden box, I expected to find faded photographs, forgotten letters, maybe a piece of jewelry she wanted me to keep. Instead, lying carefully folded beneath everything else was a beautiful vintage dress wrapped in soft white fabric, and on top of it rested a handwritten note with my name. My hands started shaking before I even unfolded the paper. I had no idea that the next few minutes would completely change everything I believed about my family, my grandmother, and even myself. If someone had told me a week earlier that I would be standing in front of a mirror wearing that dress because of my grandmother's final wish, I would have laughed and walked away. But this wasn't a joke. It was the last promise I could ever make to the woman who loved me more than anyone else in the world. And what happened after I kept that promise is something I will never forget for the rest of my life. The letter began with words that instantly brought tears to my eyes. "My dear grandson, if you are reading this, it means I am no longer there to hug you. I have only one final wish, and I hope you will trust me enough to fulfill it before you judge it." I paused for a long moment. My heart was pounding. I continued reading. "Please wear the dress I have left for you, and visit the place where we used to feed the birds together every Sunday morning. Do not ask anyone why. Do not explain yourself. Just go, and everything will make sense." I read those lines over and over again, hoping I had misunderstood them. Wear the dress? Me? It sounded impossible. My grandmother had always been kind, wise, and practical. She never asked for anything strange. Why would this be her final request? For 3 days, I kept the box hidden in my closet. Every time I walked past it, I felt guilty. I had promised her while she was in the hospital that I would honor her last wish, no matter what it was. At that time, I imagined she might ask me to take care of the garden or donate to a charity she loved. Never this. I barely slept. My mind was filled with questions that had no answers. Was this some kind of test? Was there another letter waiting somewhere? Or had she known something about herself or about me that I never understood? On the 4th morning, I finally opened the box again. I carefully unfolded the dress. It wasn't flashy or embarrassing. It was elegant, simple, and beautifully made with tiny hand-sewn details that showed someone had spent countless hours creating it. As I held it in my hands, I noticed another small note tucked inside the sleeve. It simply read, "Confidence begins where fear ends." I stood in front of my bedroom mirror for almost 20 minutes before gathering enough courage to change. Every negative thought imaginable rushed through my mind. What if someone saw me? What if people laughed? What if my neighbors recognized me? My hands trembled as I zipped up the dress. When I finally looked at my reflection, I didn't see someone pretending to be someone else. I saw someone confronting fear for the very first time. It felt unfamiliar, uncomfortable, but strangely peaceful. I covered myself with a long coat before stepping outside. Even with the coat hiding everything, my heartbeat echoed in my ears. Every passing car felt like it was slowing down. Every stranger seemed to be looking directly at me, even though most people were simply living their own lives without paying attention. Fear has a funny way of convincing us that everyone is watching when, in reality, they're usually focused on themselves. The old park looked exactly the way it had when I was a child. The same giant oak tree stood proudly near the entrance. The pond reflected the morning sunlight, and birds still gathered near the benches waiting for people to feed them. I slowly removed my coat exactly where my grandmother's letter instructed me to stand. My legs felt weak. I wanted to run away, but I remembered her smile, her gentle voice, and every lesson she had ever taught me about kindness and courage. An elderly woman sitting nearby looked at me for several seconds before smiling warmly. She slowly walked over and asked, "You're Margaret's grandson, aren't you?" My eyes widened. I nodded without saying a word. She reached into her purse and handed me an old photograph. My breath caught in my throat. The picture showed my grandmother standing beside a young person wearing the exact same dress I had on. I looked closer. That young person wasn't a woman. It was my grandfather. The woman smiled through tears. "Your grandmother told me this day would come someday." I couldn't believe what I was seeing. She explained that decades earlier, during difficult times, my grandfather had secretly performed in community theater. One night, The lead actress became seriously ill just hours before an important charity performance that was raising money for children in need. Without hesitation, my grandfather volunteered to wear the costume and save the show. Many people expected laughter, but instead the audience gave him a standing ovation because of his courage and generosity. That single performance inspired countless donations, saved the struggling theater, and raised enough money to help hundreds of families. But not everyone understood. Some people mocked him afterward. Others questioned his character, without knowing the truth. Through every cruel comment, my grandmother stood proudly beside him, reminding him that doing something good was always more important than protecting your image. The elderly woman pointed toward the dress. Your grandmother made that with her own hands. She kept it all these years because she believed courage should never disappear with the people who first showed it. Suddenly, everything made sense. This wasn't about clothing. This wasn't about appearances. This was about bravery.
About compassion.
About refusing to let fear decide how you live. As I stood there absorbing the story, several people walking through the park smiled at me. One young girl waved happily before returning to feed the birds with her father. An older man quietly nodded with respect. No one laughed. No one pointed. The terrifying reactions I had imagined existed only inside my own mind. For the first time in my life, I understood something my grandmother had tried to teach me since childhood. Most prisons are invisible. They're built from fear, shame, and the opinions we imagine others have about us. The strongest walls are the ones we build ourselves. Before leaving, I sat on our favorite bench. I scattered birdseed across the ground just like we used to do together. Hundreds of birds gathered around me without caring what I looked like, what I wore, or whether I matched anyone's expectations. They simply came because kindness had brought them there. As I prepared to leave, I noticed one final envelope taped beneath the bench exactly where my grandmother had said everything would make sense. My hands shook again as I opened it. My dear grandson, if you found this letter, then you were brave enough to trust me. Never let anyone convince you that courage only comes in one form. Sometimes courage is speaking up. Sometimes it's staying kind when others are cruel. Sometimes it's wearing something that scares you because your heart is stronger than your fear. People will always judge what they don't understand, but the people who truly matter will always judge you by your kindness. I never wanted you to wear this dress because of the dress itself. I wanted you to experience the freedom that comes when fear no longer controls your decisions. I couldn't stop crying. Walking home that afternoon felt completely different from walking to the park. Nothing around me had changed. Yet everything had changed. I smiled at strangers. I stood taller. The fear that had nearly stopped me from honoring my grandmother's wish had quietly disappeared, replaced by gratitude. Months later, I framed both of her letters and the old photograph. Whenever life becomes difficult or I find myself worrying too much about what other people think, I look at them and remember that true strength isn't about fitting into someone else's expectations. It's about living honestly, treating others with respect, and having the courage to do what you know is right even when it feels uncomfortable. My grandmother's final wish was never really about a dress. It was about passing down a legacy of courage that had already survived one generation. Now it had reached me. And one day, when someone asks me what the greatest gift my grandmother ever gave me was, I won't mention the box, the photograph, or even the letters. I'll tell them she gave me something far more valuable. She gave me the freedom to stop living in fear, because the moment fear loses its power, life truly begins. And that is a gift no one can ever take away. The following weeks became something I never expected. I thought fulfilling my grandmother's wish would be the end of the story, but it was only the beginning. Every morning I found myself thinking about her words. Confidence begins where fear ends. They echoed in my mind whenever I doubted myself. I had spent years making decisions based on what other people might think. Suddenly, I started asking a different question. What if I stopped letting imaginary opinions control my life? One Saturday, while cleaning the attic, I found another dusty suitcase tucked behind an old bookshelf. At first, I assumed it contained winter blankets or forgotten decorations. But when I opened it, I realized my grandmother had left behind far more than memories. Inside were dozens of carefully organized photographs, newspaper clippings, handwritten journals, theater programs, and several beautifully folded outfits. Every item had a small note attached explaining where it came from and why she had saved it. One newspaper clipping immediately caught my attention. The headline read, "Unknown Volunteer Saves Charity Performance." There was no photograph, but I instantly knew the article was about my grandfather. According to the story, the performance had nearly been canceled because the lead actress became seriously ill. Rather than disappoint hundreds of people who had purchased tickets to support a children's hospital, one volunteer stepped forward without revealing his identity. The audience never knew until years later who had worn the costume that evening. I smiled as I imagined my grandfather backstage, probably just as nervous as I had been standing in front of my bedroom mirror. The difference was that he didn't have social media, smartphones, or cameras recording every moment. He simply chose kindness over comfort. As I continued reading my grandmother's journals, I discovered something even more surprising. She had written about fear almost every week for decades. Not fear of danger, but fear of judgment. She believed it was one of the greatest obstacles people faced in everyday life. She wrote about neighbors who avoided pursuing careers they loved because relatives disapproved. Friends who stayed in unhappy relationships because they feared gossip. Talented artists who never shared their work because they worried someone might criticize it. One sentence was underlined 3 times. The world loses countless beautiful stories because too many people are waiting for permission to be themselves. I couldn't stop thinking about that line. A few days later, I decided to visit the old community theater mentioned in the journals. It had been renovated over the years, but still carried the same charm my grandparents had described. I introduced myself to the manager and explained who my grandparents were. His eyes widened immediately. "You've been looking for this, haven't you?" he asked. Without another word, he disappeared into a storage room. When he returned, he carried an old wooden frame covered in dust. Inside was a faded cast photograph taken more than 40 years earlier. There they were. My grandmother stood proudly in the front row. My grandfather stood beside her, wearing the very same dress I had worn in the park. Neither of them looked embarrassed. Neither of them looked uncomfortable. Both were smiling with genuine happiness. The manager laughed softly. "Your grandparents were legends around here." I asked why. He leaned against the stage and began telling stories I had never heard before. Whenever the theater struggled financially, my grandparents organized charity performances. Whenever a new actor felt nervous before opening night, my grandmother encouraged them backstage. Whenever someone was bullied or mocked for being different, my grandfather made sure they never felt alone. "They didn't just perform on this stage," the manager said. "They built a family." Those words stayed with me all the way home. For the first time, I understood why so many people still remembered them decades later. It wasn't because they were famous. It wasn't because they were wealthy. It was because they made people feel accepted. That evening, I posted one photograph online alongside a simple caption. "My grandparents taught me that courage is choosing kindness over fear." I expected maybe a few friends would react. Instead, thousands of people shared the post within days. Comments poured in from complete strangers. One person admitted they had hidden their passion for fashion because they feared criticism. Another confessed they had always wanted to perform on stage, but never found the confidence. A retired teacher wrote that my grandparents' story reminded her of a student who changed lives simply by refusing to judge others. For hours, I sat reading message after message. I realized something remarkable. Everyone carries a fear they rarely talk about. The details are different. The feeling is the same. Weeks later, I received an unexpected phone call. The community theater wanted to organize a special anniversary event celebrating volunteers who had quietly changed lives over the years. They asked whether I would tell my grandparents' story. My first instinct was to decline. Standing in front of hundreds of people sounded terrifying. Then I remembered the promise hidden inside my grandmother's letters. Confidence begins where fear ends. I accepted. The night of the event, the theater was completely full. As I stepped onto the stage, my hands trembled exactly the way they had the morning I opened that wooden box. I looked around the audience. young people, parents, grandparents, children, complete strangers, all waiting. I took a deep breath and began. I didn't talk about clothing first. I talked about love, about sacrifice, about choosing compassion when it would have been easier to stay silent. Then I told them about the dress, about the park, about the photograph, about the letters. By the time I finished, the room had fallen completely silent. For several long seconds, no one moved. Then one person stood and started clapping. Another joined. Then another. Within moments, the entire audience was on its feet. The applause continued for what felt like forever. Not because of me, because everyone had recognized something deeply human inside the story. After the event ended, dozens of people waited to speak with me. One elderly man quietly wiped away tears before saying, "Your grandfather once encouraged me to audition for my first play. I was 16 years old and scared out of my mind. That one conversation changed my entire life." Another woman smiled and said, "Your grandmother convinced me that being different wasn't something to hide." I walked outside into the cool evening air feeling overwhelmed. My grandparents had been gone for years, yet their kindness was still creating ripples through people's lives. That's when I finally understood the real meaning of legacy. Legacy isn't a name carved into stone. It isn't money. It isn't possessions. It's the courage, compassion, and hope you leave behind in other people's hearts. And sometimes, all it takes to start that legacy is having the courage to honor one impossible wish. Years have passed since that unforgettable day, yet there isn't a single morning when I don't think about my grandmother's final wish. What surprised me most wasn't how wearing the dress changed me. It was how one simple act of courage seemed to unlock stories that had been hidden for decades. Every few months, another letter, another photograph, or another person somehow found their way into my life, each adding another piece to a puzzle I never knew existed. One rainy afternoon, I received a small package with no return address. Inside was an old cassette tape wrapped in brown paper. A note attached to it simply read, "Your grandmother wanted you to hear this when the time was right." I stared at the tape for several minutes. I didn't even own a cassette player anymore. After searching online, I found a small electronic shop that still repaired vintage equipment. The owner smiled when he saw the cassette. "Not many people bring these in anymore," he said. An hour later, the tape was finally ready. I pressed play. For a few seconds, there was nothing except soft static. Then I heard her voice. "My dear boy." I instantly froze. Even though years had passed since her death, I recognized that gentle voice immediately. If you're listening to this, then you've already discovered more than I could ever explain in one letter. But there is one final story I kept for last. I leaned closer. When your grandfather volunteered for that charity performance, he wasn't trying to be brave. He was terrified. He spent the entire afternoon convincing himself not to do it. 5 different times he almost walked away. What finally changed his mind wasn't confidence. It was compassion. He realized hundreds of children were depending on that fundraiser. His fear suddenly became much smaller than the reason he had to act. I closed my eyes. How many times had I waited to feel fearless before doing something important? The truth was, courage had never come first. Action came first. Confidence followed. My grandmother continued. "People often believe brave people don't feel afraid. That has never been true. Brave people simply decide something else matters more than their fear." Those words hit me harder than anything else she had ever written. For years, I had been chasing confidence. She had been trying to teach me courage instead. Near the end of the recording, she laughed softly. "There's one more surprise waiting for you. I hope it makes you smile." The tape clicked to an end. That was it. No explanation. No clues. Just another mystery. A week later, I received a call from the lawyer who had handled my grandmother's estate. "There was one safety deposit box we couldn't access until now," he explained. "It was registered under both your grandparents' names." When I arrived at the bank, I expected another stack of letters. Instead, there was a single leather-bound notebook. Its cover was worn with age. Across the front, in elegant handwriting, were 4 simple words. "Things we never regretted." I smiled before even opening it. Every page contained one memory. helping strangers, donating anonymously, standing beside friends during difficult times, forgiving people who never apologized, trying things that frightened them, traveling when money was tight, laughing during difficult seasons, choosing kindness even when nobody noticed. At the very back of the notebook, there was one blank page. Nothing else. No instructions. No explanation. Just an empty page waiting to be filled. I suddenly understood. It wasn't unfinished. It had been left for me. That evening I wrote my very first entry. I kept Grandma's final wish. Months later I added another. I gave my first public speech. Then another. I encouraged someone else to face their fear. Little by little the blank page became several pages. Eventually I needed another notebook. Then another. One decision inspired the next. One act of courage made the following one easier. One person's kindness continued creating kindness long after they were gone. Sometimes people ask me whether I still have the dress. The answer is yes. But it's no longer hanging in my closet. It's displayed inside a glass case at the community theater. Beneath it is a small plaque that doesn't mention fashion. It doesn't mention appearances. It simply reads, "Courage is choosing to help others even when you're afraid." Visitors stop to read it every day. Most have no idea who my grandparents were. Some smile. Some become emotional. A few quietly stand there for several minutes before walking away without saying a word. I've learned not to interrupt those moments. Everyone is fighting a battle nobody else can see. Sometimes a simple story arrives exactly when someone needs it most. Last year, a teenager approached me after visiting the theater. "I almost gave up on something important," he admitted. "Then I read your grandparents' story." "What happened?" I asked. He smiled. "I decided not to quit." He never told me what he had been struggling with. He didn't need to. That wasn't the point. The point was that hope had reached another person, exactly the way my grandparents would have wanted. As I walked home that evening, I looked up at the sky and imagined my grandmother smiling somewhere beyond the clouds. For so long, I believed her final wish had been about honoring her memory. Now I realize it was much bigger than that. She wasn't asking me to preserve the past. She was asking me to carry it forward, to become the next chapter instead of the final one. Every act of kindness, every difficult conversation, every moment we choose compassion over judgment, every time we encourage someone instead of criticizing them, those are the moments that truly define who we become. The dress was never the lesson. The fear was. And once that fear disappeared, I discovered something my grandmother had known all along. The strongest people are not the ones who never feel afraid. They are the ones who refuse to let fear make their decisions. That is the inheritance she left me. Not money, not possessions, not even memories. She left me a way to live. And every single day I wake up with one simple question. If Grandma were here today, would she be proud of the choice I'm about to make? As long as I can answer yes, I know I'm walking the path she hoped I would. Because in the end, the greatest wish she ever asked me to fulfill wasn't wearing a dress. It was becoming a person whose kindness would outlive them. And that is a wish I will keep for the rest of my life.